Christopher Harrison. In the summer of 1978, a 32-year-old geneticist at the University of Aberdeen gave a close friend a very specific instruction. If anything ever happened to her, if she died in circumstances that seemed unusual, the friend was to tell the police exactly one name. Weeks later, Brenda Page was found beaten to death in her own bed, struck around 30 times about the head and face. The man she had named was pulled in for questioning within hours. Then he was released. And a case that had seemed almost solved on the day it began went cold for 45 years, until a single stain preserved on a duvet finally told the truth. Brenda Page was born in Ipswich and educated first at University College London, where she earned a first-class degree in zoology, before completing her doctorate in genetics at the University of Glasgow. By her early 30s, she was a principal in the genetics department at the University of Aberdeen Medical School, one of very few British women in a scientific role of that seniority. To supplement her income, she also worked quietly as an escort under the name Miss Brenda Adams. She was a woman with a serious career, a complicated private life, and one dangerous person she could not shake. That person was her ex-husband, Christopher Merlin Harnett Harrison. He was a Cambridge graduate, a research scientist himself, and by all outward measures, a respectable man. The pair had married in 1972 and divorced in October of 1977. In the months that followed the divorce, Brenda took out an interdict against him, a court order that required him to stay away from her. She had grown afraid of what he might do, and she was making preparations in case that fear turned out to be justified. She confided in a close friend named Anne Lemon and gave her the clearest signal she could manage. If Brenda ever died in strange or violent circumstances, Anne was to make sure the police were told straight away that Christopher Harrison had done it. On the morning of the 14th of July, 1978, a colleague grew worried when Brenda failed to appear at work. Together with a neighbor, they entered her flat in Allen Street, Aberdeen, and found her body on the blood-stained bed. She had suffered at least 20 distinct injuries to the head and face. Police followed her earlier warning almost immediately. Harrison was located, interviewed, and held. But when prosecutors reviewed the evidence, they concluded there was not enough to bring a charge. He walked free, and Brenda Page, one of the brightest young geneticists of her generation, was buried without answers. For decades, that was where the case sat. Detectives moved on, colleagues retired, and Harrison lived quietly into his 60s and then his 70s, in a life that appeared, from the outside, untouched by what had happened in 1978. He had remarried at one point after Brenda's death. He held down a professional career. He was still, on paper, a man of no criminal convictions at all. But in 2015, 37 years after Brenda died, Police Scotland made the decision to reopen the file. A dedicated cold case team was assigned to it. Officers took more than 500 new statements from friends, colleagues, and anyone connected to Brenda's life in the months before her death. And most critically, they returned to the physical evidence that had been carefully preserved in police storage since 1978. Among those items was the duvet from her bed. What could a piece of fabric locked away for 4 decades still reveal? The answer was almost everything. A forensic scientist with the Scottish Police Authority named Andrew Gibb re-examined a semen stain recovered from the duvet using techniques that had not existed at the time of the original investigation. When he compared the resulting profile against Harrison, the match was overwhelming. Gibb told the court it was 590 million times more likely that the sample had come from Harrison than from any other man. In 2020, at the age of 79, Christopher Harrison was arrested and charged with the murder of his former wife. The trial opened at the High Court in Aberdeen in the spring of 2023. It ran for 10 days. Harrison's defense team argued that the presence of his DNA on the duvet was consistent with an innocent explanation, given that he had been Brenda's husband. But the court also heard evidence about the state of the marriage before her death, about the interdict she had taken out, and about the warning she had left with Anne Lemon. Anne Lemon, by then in her 80s, gave evidence about the warning her friend had given her 45 years earlier, and told the jury she had waited most of her adult life to be able to repeat it in a courtroom. The jury deliberated for around 2.5 hours before returning a majority verdict of guilty. On the 9th of March, Lord Richardson sentenced Harrison to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge described the killing as a sustained, vicious, and premeditated attack, carried out after a campaign of stalking, and said that Brenda Page's life had come to a brutal and premature end. Harrison was 82 years old on the day he was led from the dock. He lodged an appeal against both conviction and sentence. Appeal judges refused to hear his lawyer's arguments, describing the challenge as incompetent. He then indicated an intention to take the case to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission. As of now, Christopher Harrison remains in prison, and given his age, most reporting on the case has concluded that he will almost certainly die there. A memorial plaque and a tree in Brenda Page's honor are being planned at the University of Aberdeen, where she once taught. Her story was later revisited in a 2024 BBC documentary examining how the case was finally solved. Aberdeen in 1978 was not the only Scottish city where a woman's killer walked free for decades. 200 miles south, in a top-floor flat in Partick, Glasgow, another grandmother was about to disappear from an ordinary Wednesday evening. And the man responsible would slip back into a prison cell before anyone even realized she was missing. Graham McGill. Mary McLaughlin had spent the evening the way she often did. A drink at the Hindland pub in Glasgow's West End, a game of dominoes with familiar faces, and then a stop at Armando's chip shop on Dumbarton Road for fritters and cigarettes on the way home. By 11:15 on the night of the 26th of September, 1984, she was walking back to her third-floor flat at Crathie Court in Partick. 6 days later, her son found her body inside that flat. She had been strangled with the cord of her own dressing gown, wound 3 times around her neck. And the man responsible would not be arrested for another 35 years, because on the night he killed her, he was already supposed to be locked inside a prison cell. Mary McLaughlin was 58 years old, a mother of 11 children, and a grandmother many times over. She lived alone in a modest flat in one of Glasgow's tight-knit western neighborhoods. Friends and family described her as trusting and friendly, the kind of woman who might chat to a stranger at a bus stop or invite an acquaintance in for tea. That warmth was, in the end, the quality her killer exploited. The man was Graham McGill, then 22 years old. He had, at the time of Mary's death, been serving a prison sentence handed down in 1981 for assault with intent to rape. He was, in other words, a known serious sex offender, and one who was still in the middle of serving out the sentence he had received for the previous attack. But that autumn, the prison authorities had granted him a period of temporary leave from custody, known formally as a day release. He left his cell, made his way into Glasgow, and by the early hours of the 27th of September was inside Mary McLaughlin's flat. A prison governor's logbook, recovered decades later, would confirm what happened afterwards. Within hours of leaving her home, McGill had returned to prison, checked back in, and gone to sleep as if the night had contained nothing at all. Mary's body was discovered on the 2nd of October, 1984, by her son Martin Cullen. The scene showed intimate, close-quarter violence. She had been strangled. Her body had been covered with a green dress. Police launched a major investigation, chased dozens of lines of inquiry, and gathered every piece of forensic material they could recover. But the technology of 1984 could not read that evidence in any meaningful way. Suspects came and went. Reviews of the case were opened in 1999, in 2002, and again in 2006. Each one closed without a name attached. The paper bags in which detectives had stored the evidence, filled with cigarette ends, clothing, and fabric samples from the scene, remained undisturbed on the shelves of a police archive, waiting for the science to catch up. How does a killer walk out of a prison, take a life, and walk back in without a single officer suspecting him for the next 30 years? The answer began to emerge in 2014, when a fifth cold case review was opened, and forensic scientist Joanne Cochran, working out of the Scottish crime campus at Gartcosh, returned to the physical exhibits from Mary McLaughlin's flat. The paper bag storage method that police had used in 1984, dismissed by some at the time as old-fashioned, had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had preserved the DNA on the items for decades without degrading it. Among the exhibits was a cigarette end. It had been hidden, quite literally, inside the knot of the dressing gown ligature used to strangle her. Cochran also identified male DNA on the green dress covering the body and on a black bra. When those samples were tested against the national database, one profile came back with a match probability of greater than 1 billion to 1. A second sample sat at 85,000 to 1. All of them pointed to Graham McGill. The Gartcosh facility, which houses the Scottish Police Authority's forensic services alongside Police Scotland's Specialist Crime Division, has since become a central hub for exactly this kind of long-gap re-examination work. And the McGill case is one of the ones its scientists point to when describing what modern analysis can do with material that has sat in evidence bags for decades. He was arrested on the 4th of December, 2019. By that stage, McGill was in his late 50s. His trial ran for 4 days at the High Court, and the jury took roughly 2 hours to return a guilty verdict. On the 18th of May, 2021, Lord Burns sentenced McGill to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years. The judge told him directly that Mary McLaughlin's family had been forced to wait almost 4 decades to discover who was responsible for her death, and that the identification had been made possible only because of the diligence of the officers and scientists who had refused to close the file. Her relatives, giving statements outside court, said 14 years was not enough, and made clear that in their view, a life sentence should mean life imprisonment in practice. As of now, Graham McGill remains in prison. He was 59 at the time of conviction. His crime, and the way it was finally solved, was later featured in a BBC documentary tracing how modern forensics reopened a file that 4 separate reviews had failed to close. For Mary's children and grandchildren, the identification of her killer brought a form of closure, but no real peace. The man who took her life had already been serving a prison sentence for another crime against another woman on the very night he walked into her home. 12 years after Mary McLaughlin died in Partick, another woman would be strangled in her own Glasgow flat under strikingly similar circumstances. The killer would then vanish back into ordinary life, raise a family, run a business, and go undetected for more than 2 decades, until a completely unrelated arrest for a completely unrelated incident put his DNA into the system. Zhimin Chen. On the night of the 23rd of November, 1997, A 21-year-old mother named Tracy Wilde went into the center of Glasgow. She was captured on CCTV in the city's red light district at around 3:20 in the morning. A neighbor later reported hearing an argument coming from inside her flat at around 5:20. By the following day, Tracy was dead. She had been strangled in her own home, and for the next 21 years, the man responsible would build a life in plain sight, marry, raise children, and run a busy fast food business, while an innocent man on the other side of the world was hounded and nearly extradited for a killing he had nothing to do with. Tracy Wilde was 21 at the time of her death. She had given birth to a daughter in August of 1994 and had been raised largely by her grandparents. Police at the time described her background as turbulent, and by the mid-1990s she was working as a sex worker in Glasgow. She lived in a small flat in Barmulloch, on the northern edge of the city. The man who killed her was Ji Min Chen. He was 22 years old at the time, Chinese-born, with no previous convictions and no obvious connection to the neighborhood. What he did in the early hours of the 24th of November left investigators with a partial DNA profile recovered from Tracy's flat, and very little else to work with. The initial manhunt was substantial. Officers worked the case for 2.5 years without finding him. Detectives circulated descriptions across the city, interviewed hundreds of people, and worked their way through the network of men who had been present in Glasgow's red light district that night. And then, without any resolution, the file quietly went cold. The investigation did not simply fail to catch Chen. It also seriously damaged the life of an entirely innocent man. Detectives had turned their focus onto an Indian student named Sugat Mukherjee, who had been in Glasgow at the time of Tracy's death and who was pursued as a suspect for years afterwards. Even after he returned to India, Scottish officers continued to press the case against him. Extradition proceedings were opened. Mukherjee lost his job. His name and photograph appeared in press coverage of the killing. He would later say, in interviews given after the actual killer was caught, that the accusation had shattered his life in ways he could not undo. A cold case review in 2013 produced no fresh answers. It seemed possible, at that point, that Tracy's killer would never be found. How does a man commit a killing, walk away without leaving a name behind, and then hand himself in more than 2 decades later without ever meaning to? The answer arrived in July of 2018, and it had almost nothing to do with the original investigation. Chen was arrested that month in Cowcaddens, in central Glasgow, over an alleged assault. As a matter of standard procedure, officers took a routine DNA sample. When that sample was entered into the national database, it triggered a match against the unknown profile that had been sitting in Tracy Wilde's file since 1997. 21 years after the killing, the man who had committed it was in custody by accident. In the decades between the crime and the match, Chen had made a life for himself in Scotland. He had married. He had children. He was running the Dragon Chinese restaurant in East Kilbride, a busy fast food business that had been part of the local community for years. Neighbors and customers described him as ordinary, hard-working, and unremarkable. Exactly the kind of description that made the arrest, when it came, all the more startling. When officers first put the DNA match to him, Chen offered no meaningful explanation for how his profile had come to be found at the scene of a killing committed in a city he had lived and worked in for more than 2 decades. Chen pleaded guilty on the 24th of April, 2019, at the High Court in Glasgow. Sentencing came the following month. Lord Arthurson imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge described the killing as a brutal, cowardly, and murderous attack on a vulnerable young woman inside her own home, and noted that Chen had enjoyed more than 2 decades of what he called undetected freedom. For Tracy's family, The sentence was significant, but it was not the end of it. Chen appealed the length of his minimum term. His legal team, led by the veteran defense advocate Donald Findlay, argued successfully before Lord Menzies, Lord Drummond-Young, and Lord Glennie that the punishment part of his sentence should be reduced. It was cut from 20 years to 16. Tracy's sister, Bernadette McCash, described the reduction as a slap in the face. As of now, Ji-Min Chen remains in prison, but his family and Tracy's continue to sit on opposite sides of a decision that shortened the time he was originally ordered to serve. There is one further note on this case, and it is one that police services across the United Kingdom have taken seriously in the years since. Chen was not caught by any technique aimed at him. He was caught only because he committed another offense in a different part of Glasgow more than 20 years later, in a country where routine DNA sampling had by then become standard for people brought in on suspicion of unrelated crimes. Without that sample, the killing of Tracy Wilde may well have remained an unsolved file forever. A little under a decade after Tracy's body was found in her Barmulloch flat, another young woman would go missing in Glasgow. She would be reported missing after a week. And when her body was found, 5 days later, hidden under the floorboards of the very church where she worked. The investigation that followed would uncover one of the most prolific serial killers Scotland has ever produced. Peter Tobin. On the 24th of September 2006, a 23-year-old Polish language student named Angelika Kluck vanished from a small parish community in Glasgow. She had been working as a cleaner at St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church in Anderston to help fund her studies. When her body was found 5 days later, it was inside the same church. She had been placed beneath a wooden hatch in the floor, close to the confessional, her hands bound, her body covered with a tarpaulin. She had been raped, beaten, and stabbed 16 times. The man responsible had introduced himself to the parish under a false name, and the moment a DNA sample from his previous life reached a police database, his real identity and the trail of missing women he had left behind him began to fall into view. Angelika Kluck was a language student from Gdańsk University in Poland. She had come to Scotland to study, to work, and to save money. She was intelligent, quietly ambitious, and by all accounts liked by everyone at St. Patrick's, where she cleaned and helped with day-to-day tasks around the church. She was also unaware that the handyman who had recently been taken in by the parish, a man calling himself Pat McLaughlin, was not who he said he was at all. The real name of that man was Peter Tobin. He was a registered sex offender who had gone off the police radar in October of 2005 by failing to report to the authorities as required. He had a previous conviction from 1993 for the rape of 2 schoolgirls in Hampshire, for which he had served 10 years in prison. On his release, he had been required to remain in contact with the authorities under the terms of the Sex Offenders Register. Instead, he had drifted north, changed his name to Pat McLaughlin, and inserted himself into the life of a Glasgow parish that had extended him kindness. On the day Angelika disappeared, he moved her from the church to the adjoining garage, killed her there, and then carried out a calculated concealment. Her body was placed beneath the floor of the church itself. For 5 days she was missing. Police searched the building, spoke to parishioners, and initially treated the case as a missing person inquiry. Officers eventually returned to the church with a fuller search team, and it was during that second search that Angelika's body was found beneath the floorboards near the confessional. The parish priest who had welcomed the man, calling himself Pat McLaughlin, into the church community, was among the first to be interviewed by detectives. And it was through the parish records and the priest's account of where the handyman had been staying that officers were able to reconstruct Tobin's movements in the days before the killing. Forensic scientist Carol Weston identified impact blood spatter in the church garage that pointed to it as the actual scene of the killing. A blood-stained wooden table leg, believed to have been used as a weapon during the attack, was recovered from the garden. Inside Angelica's body, seminal fluid yielded a full DNA profile. But when investigators ran that profile against the Scottish DNA database, which held roughly 280,000 records at the time, they got nothing. How does a man walk into a church, adopt a fake name, and disappear again as easily as he arrived? The answer came from a wider search. The DNA profile was then run against the UK-wide database, and there, it returned a single name: Peter Tobin, connected to a Hampshire sex offense from 1993. That match told investigators exactly who the man calling himself Pat McLaughlin really was. Tobin, by this point, had already fled Glasgow for London. He was arrested only after a nurse recognized his photograph from the media coverage, while he was being treated at a hospital under yet another false name. Fingerprints found on the tarpaulin and the bin bag used to conceal Angelica's body would later be matched to him as well. His trial opened at the High Court in Edinburgh and ran for 6 weeks. In May of 2007, Peter Tobin was convicted of the murder of Angelica Cluck. Judge Lord Menzies sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years, and told the court that he was, without qualification, an evil man. As Tobin was let out of the dock, he kicked out at photographers waiting at the doors of the court. But the story did not end there. The Angelica Cluck case became the starting point for what Strathclyde police called Operation Anagram, a national initiative launched in 2006 to examine every location where Peter Tobin had ever lived, worked, or hidden. That work would produce 2 further convictions. In 2008, Tobin was convicted of the killing of 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton, who had vanished in 1991 after missing a bus in Bathgate, West Lothian, on her way home to see her father. In 2009, he was convicted of the killing of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol, who had disappeared the same year while hitchhiking home from a music festival in Hampshire. Both bodies were recovered by police from the garden of a house Tobin had once lived in on the coast of Kent, in Margate. He would ultimately be handed 3 separate life sentences, and Vicky Hamilton's minimum term was later increased to 30 years. Over the years, speculation grew that Tobin might have been responsible for as many as 48 killings. Detective Superintendent David Swindle, who had led the original investigation, has repeatedly stated that the figure came from public speculation rather than from anything Tobin himself ever admitted. He was convicted of 3 murders. That, on the record, is where his known crimes end. Peter Tobin died on the 8th of October, 2022, at HMP Edinburgh, at the age of 76. Because no member of his family came forward to claim his remains, his ashes were later scattered at sea. For Angelica Cluck's family in Poland, and for the families of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, the DNA cross-match on the UK database in 2006 was the thread that finally exposed a man who had spent decades slipping between identities and killing women he was trusted enough to be left alone with. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Rhys Bennett. In the early hours of the 17th of September, 2022, a 47-year-old mother of 2 named Jill Barkley was walking home from a night out in Aberdeen. She had briefly crossed paths earlier that evening with a group of men at a pub called the Spider's Web in Dice. One of them, a stranger she had never met and would never see again in any ordinary way, waited for her to leave. He followed her home. What he did to her in the empty grounds of a nearby property was so violent that the judge who sentenced him would later describe it as medieval in its barbarity. And within hours of her body being found, the forensic trail she left behind would put his name in front of investigators. Jill Barclay was 47 years old at the time of her death. She worked as a proposals engineer for the energy services firm Petrofac. She was a mother of 2 young children, aged 6 and 8, and had grown up in the Aberdeen area, attending Hazelhead Academy as a student. Friends and colleagues described her as warm, competent, and quietly devoted to her family. On the evening of the 16th of September, she had been out with friends. By the small hours of the following morning, she was walking home alone through Dice. The man who followed her was Rhys Bennett, a 23-year-old fencing laborer from Ballingry in Fife. He had traveled to Aberdeen for work and was in the spider's web that evening with his colleagues. Acquaintances described him as reclusive, a young man who kept himself apart from other people and had few close relationships. He and Jill had never met before that evening, and their contact at the pub had been brief and incidental. But something in that brief encounter fixed itself in Bennett's mind. As Jill made her way home, he left the pub and went after her on foot, tracking her at a distance through the streets of Dice. He waited, and in the grounds of an unoccupied property near Farburn Gatehouse, he attacked her. The attack was prolonged and severe. Prosecutor Lorraine Glancy, King's counsel, later described it in court as extreme, sustained, and feral. Bennett struck her repeatedly, kicked her, stamped on her, and raped her. A dog walker passing nearby heard a woman screaming the word "no," but did not call the police at the time, later telling investigators he had assumed it was a domestic argument. Residents in a nearby flat also heard screams. Bennett left the scene, went to his van, and returned. He then poured petrol on Jill and set her alight. Forensic evidence would later establish that she was still alive when he did so. Her body was discovered in the street near the Marriott Hotel on Stonywood Road at around 3:30 in the morning. Because so many of the details of the attack were captured by CCTV cameras across Dice that night, investigators had a working timeline before the sun had even risen. Cameras traced Bennett's movements from the pub to the scene and traced his van as it returned. He then drove south, back to his home in Fife. His t-shirt was found to be stained with Jill's blood. Her blood was also found inside his van and in the bathroom sink of his home, where he had tried to wash himself and his clothing after driving south. He would later admit to burning and washing further items of clothing in an attempt to destroy evidence. DNA belonging to Bennett was recovered from under Jill's fingernails and on her phone case. She had fought him, and in doing so, she had left behind the evidence that would identify him. How does a stranger cross paths with a woman for a single moment at a pub and end her life a few hours later? That question is one the courts, in the end, could not fully answer. Bennett was arrested within days of the killing, on the 24th of May, 2023. He appeared at the High Court in Edinburgh and pleaded guilty under accelerated procedure, a mechanism in Scots law known as Section 76 that allows a defendant to admit a serious charge without a full trial. He pleaded guilty to a composite charge of assault, rape, and murder, along with a separate charge of attempting to defeat the ends of justice by destroying evidence. Lord Arthurson imposed a life sentence with a punishment part of 24 years for the assault, rape, and murder, and imposed a further 4-year term for the destruction of evidence to run concurrently. He was placed on the sex offenders register indefinitely. The judge told him directly that what he had done was unimaginably wicked, and described the acts against Jill Barclay as medieval in their barbarity. He also noted that had it not been for Bennett's guilty plea and the fact that he was under 25 at the time of the offense, the punishment part would have been at least 29 years. That final detail became the source of significant political controversy. In the days after the sentencing, Scottish Conservative MSP Russell Findlay raised the case at Holyrood, criticizing the sentencing guidelines that reduce minimum terms for offenders under 25. The debate that followed touched on a broader question about whether adult violent offenders in their early 20s should benefit from age-related sentencing reductions. Jill's family, in statements outside the court, described the sentence as inadequate and expressed a sense of anger that would not settle. Her parents, giving a joint statement to reporters, said that no punishment part, however long, could ever be equal to what had been taken from their 2 grandchildren. They asked, in the same statement, that the public remember their daughter for her working life, for her devotion to her children, and for the ordinary details of the life she had built, rather than for the manner of her death. As of now, Rhys Bennett remains in prison. His punishment part does not expire until the mid-2040s, and he will not be eligible for parole consideration until then. For Jill Barclay's 2 young children, the loss is one that will shape every part of the rest of their lives. And for investigators, the case stands as a stark example of how modern forensic techniques, combined with dense CCTV coverage in a modern British city, can now convert a stranger attack in the middle of the night into a solved case within days. The Bennett case is one of several in recent Scottish criminal history where a killer known or unknown to the authorities was caught almost immediately by the physical evidence he left behind. A year earlier, in a quiet Glasgow neighborhood, a woman celebrated for a lifetime of community work would be attacked in her own home. And the man responsible was already on a register that was supposed to prevent exactly that from happening. Jason Graham. On the evening of the 28th of May, 2021, a 30-year-old man was thrown out of a pub in Glasgow's West End for aggressive behavior. He had been drinking with relatives. He was already known to police as a registered sex offender who had raped an older woman almost a decade earlier, and who had been released back into the community 3 years before. He was supposed to be under monitoring, and in practical terms, he was not. Over the next few hours, that man scaled a wall into a community garden, tried a locked garage door, and eventually forced his way into the attic flat of a 67-year-old woman named Esther Brown. She died as a result, and a case that took only days to solve would go on to expose deep, systemic failures in how Scotland monitors its most dangerous offenders. Esther Brown was a much-loved figure in the Woodlands area of Glasgow. She was 67 years old, a community and charity volunteer, and a founding member of the Woodlands Community Garden. She lived alone in an attic flat on West Princes Street. Friends described her as generous, curious, and endlessly interested in the people around her. The man who killed her was Jason Graham, 30 years old at the time. He was also known by the surname Evans, having legally changed his name in the weeks before the attack. He was a stranger to Esther Brown. He had no connection to her building, her neighborhood, or her life. But he was carrying a criminal record that should have kept him under close supervision. In 2013, he had been convicted of raping an older woman, an offense for which he had received a lengthy prison sentence and been placed on the sex offenders register. He had been released on a non-parole license in June 2018, meaning he was not subject to active parole supervision after leaving prison. Recommendations that he complete a sex offender rehabilitation program in custody had gone unmet. He had never finished the course, and the responsibility for monitoring him after release fell to a small number of overstretched agencies in the community. On the night of the 28th of May, after being ejected from licensed premises, Graham made his way through the West End of Glasgow in a state of alcohol-fueled aggression. Later, CCTV footage would show him climbing a wall into the community garden Esther had helped found, moving through nearby gardens, testing a locked garage door, and eventually arriving at the rear of her block. He forced entry into her flat. He punched her, kicked her, stamped on her, and struck her with pieces of a broken wooden chair. He also raped her. She died of blunt force injuries to her head and chest. He was not in the moment, thinking about how to conceal what he had done. Before leaving, he took her bank card and used it at a nearby shop to buy tobacco. He also stuffed her landline and mobile phones into the U-bend of her toilet. Her body was discovered on the 1st of June, 3 days after her death, when concerned friends could not reach her. Could a system designed to monitor known sex offenders have prevented what happened to Esther Brown? The evidence that identified Jason Graham was found at the scene almost immediately. Traces of his DNA were recovered inside her flat. That DNA was linked to Graham, who was already known to police as a registered sex offender being monitored in the community. CCTV footage and the use of Esther's bank card at a nearby shop corroborated the forensic picture. Within days, he was in custody. He pleaded guilty on the 15th of October, 2021, at the High Court in Glasgow. In November of the same year, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. David Green, the prosecutor from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, described what Graham had done as a shockingly brutal attack on a woman in her own home. But the story of Esther Brown's death did not end at Jason Graham's sentencing. It moved almost immediately into the political sphere. A 60-page significant case review was commissioned, containing 11 recommendations and 14 learning points. It examined how a man with Graham's history had been living in the community with, in practical terms, minimal oversight. Its conclusions were controversial. The review found that the killing of Esther Brown could not, in the reviewer's judgment, have been predicted or prevented. Campaigners and Esther's own colleagues at the community garden publicly rejected that conclusion. They pointed to the fact that Graham had never completed sex offender rehabilitation, that he had been on a non-parole license, and that the machinery of state supervision had, in the year leading up to her death, largely lost sight of him. The report's findings were subsequently raised in the Scottish Parliament, where MSPs pressed ministers on how many other men with Graham's profile were currently being supervised under similar arrangements. As of now, Jason Graham remains in prison. The case has continued to feed into a national conversation in Scotland about how offenders like him are supervised after release, and what responsibility public bodies bear when someone with his record commits an offense of this severity. For those who knew Esther Brown, the answer to that question still matters more than the outcome of any single review. The Woodlands Community Garden, the small green space she had helped establish in the shadow of Glasgow's West End tenements, is now maintained partly in her memory. And the volunteers who work there continue to raise her name in conversations with local politicians and journalists about the gaps in the sex offender supervision system that were exposed by her death. 2 years before Esther Brown was killed in her Glasgow flat, another grandmother was attacked in her own home 200 miles to the north. The man responsible had a criminal record of extraordinary length. And when police arrived at the scene, the evidence that would put him away was already there, under her fingernails. Norman Duncan. On the 25th of September, 2019, a 40-year-old laborer under the influence of crack cocaine made 3 separate visits to a residential block in the Seaton area of Aberdeen. He was looking for drugs. On his final visit, he was let in by a 54-year-old grandmother named Margaret Robertson. What followed was 109 minutes of violence that ended with her death. Her friends found her the following day, when they noticed her front door was unlocked. And by the time police arrived, the man responsible had already left his DNA in 3 separate places on her body and on the door of her bedroom. Margaret Robertson, known to her family as Meg, was 54 years old at the time of her death. She was a grandmother, a much-loved daughter, and a woman well known in her small community at Promenade Court on Aberdeen's Seton Estate. She lived alone. She had a wide circle of friends and family who visited her regularly, and it was one of them who eventually found her. The man who killed her was Norman Duncan, a 40-year-old laborer with a criminal record almost impossible to summarize. By the time of Margaret's death, Duncan had accumulated 74 previous convictions, 58 of which had led to custodial sentences. His record included serious assault, assault with a weapon, assault with intent to rob, and mobbing and rioting. He had been in and out of prison since he was a teenager, and had spent large portions of his adult life either in custody or under supervision. He had been diagnosed with a schizoaffective disorder, a mental illness that combines features of schizophrenia and mood disorders. He was also a long-term heavy drug user, and on the day he arrived at Promenade Court, he had been using crack cocaine. Duncan made 3 visits to Margaret's block that day, looking for drugs. On the last of those visits, he was inside her flat for about 109 minutes. During that time, he seized her, struggled with her, sexually assaulted her, and stabbed her at least 25 times, striking her head, neck, face, and body. Cause of death was later given as multiple stab wounds to the neck and face. Her near-naked body was discovered the following day by a friend who noticed that her front door had been left unlocked. What could a stab-scarred flat and a woman's own fingernails reveal about the man who had been inside with her? The answer was almost everything. Margaret had fought hard. She had defensive injuries on her hands and arms. When forensic officers examined her body, they recovered Norman Duncan's DNA from under her fingernails. His DNA was also identified on the bedroom door of her flat, alongside further forensic and CCTV evidence linking him to the scene and to the sequence of visits he had made to the block that day. In court, Duncan would lodge what is known in Scots law as a special defense of incrimination, arguing that another named person was responsible for the killing. The physical evidence made that defense very difficult to sustain. During the retrial, Duncan sat impassively through much of the proceedings, occasionally interrupting his own counsel to challenge points of testimony, and at one stage attempting to address the court directly before being asked to stop. Jurors were shown a large volume of forensic material, along with CCTV footage of Duncan entering and leaving Margaret Robertson's block on the day of her death. His first trial, in 2021, was halted before it could conclude. Duncan had been abusing psychoactive substances inside prison, and his mental health deteriorated to the point where the court felt it could not proceed. He was assessed by prison psychiatrists and moved to the state hospital at Carstairs, a high-security psychiatric facility in South Lanarkshire that treats offenders who are considered too unwell to be managed inside the ordinary prison estate. He remained there for a period of stabilization and was eventually returned to the prison system fit to stand trial. He stood trial again in 2022, and on the 23rd of March that year, he was convicted at the High Court in Edinburgh. Lord Harrower imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge described the killing as a sustained and merciless attack on a defenseless woman inside her own home, and warned Duncan that release after 20 years would not be automatic. Duncan's legal team subsequently launched an appeal against the conviction. According to a report by STV News, his lawyers took the position that he had suffered a miscarriage of justice. As of now, no outcome to that appeal has been reported. He remains in prison. For Margaret Robertson's family, the outcome of the trial was significant. But the appeal, combined with the reality of Duncan's long criminal history stretching back years before her death, has left them with the sense that the story is not yet fully closed. In the public statements made after the sentencing, the family spoke about Meg Robertson herself rather than about Duncan, describing her as a grandmother, a daughter, and a friend who cared deeply about the people around her. Duncan's arrest and conviction came within days of the physical evidence being processed. But some cases in Scottish criminal history have needed much longer to answer their basic question, and none more famous than the one that first put dive teams into a Scottish loch in December of 1999. Looking for what the press would eventually call the limbs. William Beggs. On the 6th of December, 1999, a police diving team on a routine training exercise in Loch Lomond made a discovery none of them had been expecting. What they pulled from the water was human remains. Over the days that followed, more remains would surface. 8 days later, on the 14th of December, a severed head washed up on Barassie Beach at Troon. The victim was an 18-year-old supermarket worker from Kilmarnock named Barry Wallace, who had gone missing after a work Christmas night out. The man responsible for his death and dismemberment was already, by that stage, on a plane out of the country. He believed he had got away, and back in his own flat, forensic officers were about to find the traces of blood that would keep him in custody for the rest of his life. Barry Wallace was 18 years old. He worked at a supermarket in Kilmarnock, in Ayrshire. He had gone out with colleagues on the 5th of December, 1999, to celebrate the start of the Christmas period. At some point during the course of that evening, his path crossed with a man named William Beggs. He accepted a lift, or was persuaded to accompany him back to a top-floor flat at Doon Place in Kilmarnock. He would not leave that flat alive. William Beggs was 36 years old at the time. He had been born in Northern Ireland in 1963, into a strict religious family. His history with the criminal justice system stretched back more than a decade. In 1987, he had been convicted of the murder of a student named Barry Oldham in Teesside, whose dismembered remains had been found on the North York moors. That conviction was overturned on appeal in 1989, on the basis of concerns about how the trial evidence had been handled, and Beggs walked free from prison. In 1991, he was jailed for 6 years for the serious assault of a man named Brian McQuillan, whom he had slashed with a razor after taking him back to his flat. By the time Barry Wallace crossed paths with him in Kilmarnock, Beggs was a man with a long and demonstrated capacity for extreme violence, whose earlier convictions the general public knew almost nothing about. Inside his flat at Doon Place, Beggs sexually assaulted Barry Wallace and killed him. He then dismembered the body. Over the following days, he began the process of disposing of the remains. The limbs went into Loch Lomond. The head was taken further afield. Beggs smuggled it onto the Troon to Belfast ferry and threw it overboard. Currents carried it back to shore. Barry's head was found by members of the public on Barassie Beach, 8 days after his death. The find set off a wider search along the Ayrshire coast, and it was that search, combined with the earlier recovery of the limbs from Loch Lomond, that first alerted police to the scale of what they were dealing with. Within days, Beggs had been identified as a person of interest, and detectives applied for a warrant to enter his top-floor flat in Kilmarnock. How does a man dismember a body in the middle of a Scottish town and expect no one to notice? The truthful answer is that he almost got away with it, For a time, Beggs fled the country. He traveled to the Netherlands and handed himself in to police in Amsterdam on the 28th of December, 1999. The extradition process that followed took roughly 12 months, during which he attempted every legal avenue available to remain in Dutch custody rather than face a Scottish trial. His lawyers argued that he would not receive a fair hearing in Scotland, that publicity around the case had made an impartial jury impossible, and that his human rights would be breached by extradition. Each of those arguments was tested and rejected. But while he was abroad, forensic officers had gone through his flat at Doon Place. In the folds of his washing machine, they found traces of Barry Wallace's blood. It was in other parts of the flat as well. The physical evidence tying him to the killing was, in the end, overwhelming. The trial opened at the High Court in Edinburgh on the 18th of September, 2001. Under Scots law, the jury was not informed of Beggs's previous convictions. They did not need to be. In October 2001, Beggs was convicted of the murder of Barry Wallace and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, backdated to his arrest. The story since his conviction has been shaped almost entirely by his relationship with the courts. Beggs became one of the most prolific litigants in the modern history of the Scottish legal system. He has, according to reporting by the Sunday Post, received more than £1,032,000 in public funds since 2001 to launch a series of legal challenges against his conviction and the conditions of his imprisonment. His minimum term expired in 2019. He became eligible for parole consideration at that point. The Parole Board for Scotland has repeatedly refused to release him. The most recent formal refusal came on the 27th of February, 2024. Beggs subsequently applied for a judicial review of that decision, arguing that the board had failed to properly consider the length of time he had already served and the rehabilitative work he claimed to have completed in prison. The application was heard before Lady Drummond in the outer house of the Court of Session and refused. The court upheld the board's finding that Beggs could not be safely managed in the community. He has since raised further judicial reviews, with additional hearings listed into 2025. As of now, William Beggs remains in prison. He has now served significantly longer than his original minimum term. He has been denied parole every time it has been considered. The parole board has consistently taken the view that he continues to pose a serious risk. His case was featured in the 2024 BBC documentary Limbs in the Loch, which examined how the physical evidence in his own flat, in the days after he fled to Amsterdam, produced the trail that would keep him in custody for the rest of his natural life. That's 8 Scottish cases where DNA and forensic science eventually gave the victims and their families the names they had waited for. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.